Now that we have a very clear picture of all the assets we have and we have identified the risks, let's look at risk assessment. And this is where we do our qualitative and our quantitative risk analysis, we do our risk register, and when we're done with all that, we hand it off to senior management. We would most often also do an uncertainty analysis, because all this hard work is really just your best guesses. If this happens, then this is how bad it is. We don't have a magic crystal ball where we can see all the right numbers, but our hard work and our due diligence and our due care should give them a reasonably accurate picture of how bad the risks are and how much the mitigation would cost. Now, what they do with that information is entirely up to management, and they can choose or not to act on our recommendations. So for each risk in our enterprise, we could choose to recommend a risk mitigation. We put something in place that's going to minimize the risk to an acceptable level. And again, everything here is done on a cost-benefit analysis. That is something senior leadership will clearly understand. It's going to cost us $250,000 to put this countermeasure in, but it will save us $1 million a year. Pretty simple math. We can also recommend risk transference, that is buying insurance. And you'll see an example of this as well later in this video. We can also choose to recommend risk acceptance. If the risk costs us $250,000 a year, but the countermeasure is going to cost us $1 million, maybe we should just live with it. And then finally, we can recommend risk avoidance. I will also have an example of that. This is us determining that laptops loses us $1 million a year, and we then stop issuing laptops. Then we avoid the risk. And then the final and never acceptable option is risk rejection. We know the risk is there, and since we have done at least our job, we have the paper trail to prove it, but we just kind of ignore it. That is never okay. And in the risk assessment, we would also go in and assess the current countermeasures we have in place. Because very, very rarely, we would start from a blank slate. But we would identify how good are the current countermeasures. Are they good enough? Do we need to improve on them? Or do we need to implement entirely new countermeasures? Let's begin by looking at some of the key concepts. Qualitative risk analysis is just sitting down and guessing how likely is this to happen, how bad is it if it happens, and how exposed are we. It's vague, it's guessing, it's feelings, it's pretty quick to do, and we mostly use it to identify the areas where we want to do the quantitative risk analysis. Think of qualitative risk analysis as the quality of something. That's pretty good. That's nice. It's not a specific number, it's more of an opinion. Which then leads us into quantitative risk analysis. This is where we put actual numbers on the assumptions. If this happens, how much will it cost us? It's fact-based analysis. We'll look at the cost of the asset, cost of a compromise, and math is involved. Some of the other key terms you need to know for the certification and for your job in regards to risk analysis is threat. A threat is a potential harmful incident. Really anything that can cause damage to your organization or to your data. Whereas a vulnerability is a weakness that can actually allow the threat to come to fruition. A tsunami might be a threat, but if your data center's up in the mountains, it's not a vulnerability. For you it might be snow, volcanic activity, whatever else can harm you in your area. And when we look at risk, the risk is the threat multiplied by the vulnerability. And we do at times also add impact, another vector to the equation. In that case, the risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. It's how bad it is. If we have two data centers right next to each other, and assuming they're identical, the threat and vulnerability would most likely be the same. But if one is manned and the other is unmanned, the impact to the manned one would be much higher. It gives us a clearer picture and a fuller risk analysis. If we then look at the total risk, that's the potential threat times the vulnerability and then times the asset value. And then finally we have the residual risk. That's the total risk minus any countermeasures we do. We'll look at some examples in a bit. When we look at a qualitative risk analysis, we most often use a risk analysis matrix, where we look at the likelihood of an incident happening and how bad it is if it happens. If we take the example of a laptop, how likely is it that it will get stolen or an employee forgets it somewhere? Let's assume it's possible or likely. And then we look at how bad it is if it happens. And again, that really depends on the data on the laptop. Is the laptop encrypted? Is there sensitive data on there? Let's for this example say that there's no confidential data, there's no PHI or PII, but there would be company information. So let's say it's a minor issue. If we look at the risk analysis matrix, we can see that a minor issue that's likely to happen is considered a high risk. This is probably something we should look at the quantitative risk analysis. And if we implement effective countermeasures, it might get moved to a medium or a low. And we would do this for all our assets, both tangible and intangible objects. As part of our qualitative risk analysis, we would most often also use risk registers. And it is, like many other things, just a giant Excel spreadsheet. Whereas in the qualitative approach, we just look at likelihood and impact. With a risk register, we have many more factors. And we then use that to prioritize what we're going to do something about. And we do this for the entire enterprise, anything that can be seen as a risk. We would categorize the risk, give them a name, a number. We would again use the probability and impact. Then we would have suggestions on mitigation. What can we do to fix the problem? Then contingency. What can we do if this risk actualizes? Then we give it a risk score after we have done the mitigation. Because there will probably still be residual risk. Is that residual risk acceptable, or do we need to do more mitigation? And who needs to fix it, and when do they need to fix it by? So we enter all the risks we have into this giant Excel spreadsheet, and then we pick the ones that have the highest risk score and do something about those. But remember, if we do one mitigation, that might fix other problems, or it might open up new problems. So as with anything else we do, it is an iterative process. The cycle repeats. Just like when we do patches or any change in our environment, it might fix 10 things, but it could break one other. So we need to do that in-depth analysis that is the quantitative risk analysis. I've had some students that have issues remembering the difference between the two. And the easiest way I can explain it is quantitative. Think of quantity, it's a number, it's specific. What's qualitative is quality, it's vague, it's your opinion, and separate the two like that. We use the quantitative risk analysis to ensure that we have exactly the right security posture for what we're protecting. You don't want too little security and you don't want too much. You want the exact right amount. So for any given asset, we look at the asset value. How much of the asset is compromised? How much will one incident cost? How often do the incidents occur? And how much that's going to cost us per year? Know these abbreviations and know what they do. To a large extent, they are logical. The asset value, or AV, is how much is the asset worth. The exposure factor, or EF, how much of the asset is lost in an incident. The single loss expectancy, the SLE, is the asset value times the exposure factor. What will this cost us if it happens once? The annual rate of occurrence, or ARO, how often does this happen every year? And then the annual loss expectancy, or ALE, what will this cost us every year if we do nothing? And then finally the TCO, the total cost of ownership. This is the total cost of the mitigation of the countermeasure we put in place to lower the risk and the exposure factor. This is both the initial cost and the ongoing annual cost for maintenance. Let's look at a few examples. Going back to the laptop from earlier, we have an unencrypted laptop that's stolen. The laptop's asset value is $10,000, $1,000 for the actual laptop, and $9,000 for the PII that was on the laptop. In this case, the exposure factor would be 100% because the laptop is gone, which then makes our single loss expectancy $10,000. 10,000 times 1. If our company then loses 25 laptops a year, the ALE, or annualized loss expectancy, would be $250,000. And the example on the right, we have a data center valued at $10 million. If a flooding does happen, we're expected to lose 15% of the data center, so our single loss expectancy would be $10 million times 0.15, $1.5 million. But the flooding only happens every 4 years, so the annual rate of occurrence, 0.25. So 25% of $1.5 million, that will make our annualized loss expectancy $375,000. Let's return to the laptop example and implement a countermeasure. Through our due diligence, we've determined that we want full disk encryption on the laptop and want to be able to wipe them remotely. The full disk encryption and support is going to cost us $75,000 to implement and $5,000 a year. The remote wipe capability is going to cost us $20,000 to implement and $4,000 a year in maintenance. And then finally, we need to hire extra staff to ensure that the laptops are encrypted and we have help desk support for them. That's going to cost us $25,000 a year. In this example, I've used a 4-year tech refresh cycle. So during a full tech refresh cycle, it's going to cost us $1 million. 4 years times the $250,000 we'd lose from the laptops if we do nothing. And implementing the full disk encryption and the remote wipe will cost us $231,000 per tech refresh cycle, which is again 4 years. So really it's only going to cost us $57,750 per year. We can assume the laptops will still be lost, so the $25,000, that's just the laptop value, will still be lost. But the $225,000 that was the loss from the personal identifiable information, we would no longer incur. So by spending the $57,000, we would save $225,000. And this is what we want in all our risk analysis. We want a positive ROI, return on investment. As long as the total cost of ownership is less than the annual loss expectancy, it will make sense to implement this countermeasure. How we respond to the risk after we've done an analysis is determined by the results. We can choose to accept the risk. If in the laptop example it's going to cost us $1 million to implement a countermeasure and we would only save $250,000 a year, it wouldn't be worth doing. In that case, we would accept the risk. We just need to ensure that we've done our due diligence and due care, and we have the paper trail to prove it. In the example with the laptop, we chose risk mitigation. We implemented countermeasures, and we reduced the risk to an acceptable level. The risk that's left over is the residual risk. We can also choose to transfer the risk. The data center example could be a good way to do that. We could buy flood insurance. The flood is obviously still going to happen. We would still lose 15% of the infrastructure, but we'd be insured against it. We wouldn't have to pay the $1.5 million every time it happened. We can also choose risk avoidance. Basically, we make sure that the risk can't happen. So for the laptop example, we can just stop issuing laptops to our employees. Then they can't lose them. Or for the data center, we're going to build in an area that's not prone to flooding. And this would obviously be part of our initial risk analysis before we decide on a site for our new data center. We do our due diligence, we research the area. And then we have risk rejection. This is never okay. That's you knowing the issue is there, the vulnerability is there, but you're ignoring it. You've done your due diligence, but you have not done your due care. You are going to be liable. And finally, we have the term secondary risk. That's when implementing one countermeasure opens up for another vulnerability. That could be you upgrading a software version to the latest version, which then has a vulnerability in it the previous one didn't. If we know about this vulnerability, we do the risk analysis again. And risk analysis is an iterative process. It's never over. Environments are going to be constantly changing. And with that change, we need to do the risk analysis to ensure that we're secure enough. This area is very testable. And to reiterate, qualitative risk analysis, think quality. It's vague, pretty good quality. And quantitative, think quantity. It's a specific number. How many, how much. When we're looking at risk management and risk analysis, it's often smart to use frameworks that are already in place. One of those could be the NIST Special Publication 800-30. It's a 9-step process for risk management. We'd look at the system characteristics, the scopes and boundaries of our risk, the system, and the data sensitivity. Not all systems are created equal. We'd identify the threats, identify the vulnerabilities. Look at our control analysis. What are the current and future planned safeguards, controls, and mitigations we have in place, or we're going to have in place? How likely is it to happen? This is where we'd use our qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. How bad is it if it happens? We'd look at the risk determination. From our qualitative and quantitative risk analysis, we've determined our risks and the associated risk levels. Then we'd come up with recommendations. What should we do? Mitigate, transfer, accept, or whatever risk response we suggest. And then finally, we document it. Document our risk analysis and document our recommendations. This is the paper trail I was talking about earlier. Remember, you don't make the decisions, you make the recommendations. What they do with them is up to senior management.